Good morning, dear friends, and how are we all today? We have a fascinating talk for you today. This is by our friend Chris Willmore, who will bring forward the statement, Guy Fawkes, was he framed? Chris.
Thanks ever so much. Thanks for inviting me. I wanted to start by asking, what do people on the call know about Guy Fawkes? What's your sort of take on Guy Fawkes? Who was he? What happened? What do people know about him?
If you exit slide share for the moment, you'll be able to see people raising their hands. And
I can see people. Thanks. Yes.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah.
We'll carry on from there, I think. Yes. I don't know too much about him. I know about fireworks, and he was one of the people in the gunpowder plot. So history tells us, along with a few other miscreants. And he was the government said he was the leader. So therefore, nasty things were done under him. But that's about all I know.
And that's a really helpful intro. A lot of people probably don't even realise that he was one of a grouping. And certainly the mythology from our childhood is that he was the big name. He was Mr. Big in this. But actually, that isn't what the evidence says. And there's some really interesting stories about if we look from a modern frame, and I know we shouldn't look at history from a modern frame, but if you look at history with a modern pair of eyes, there are some very odd things about Guy Fawkes, the gunpowder plot, and the whole story. And so what I was going to do today was lightheartedly say, well, in modern parlance, what actually do we know about it, and how would we view what we do know about it through a pair of modern eyes? So stay in the 21st century, but let's look back and see what we know. Now, right, here's Guy. What do we know about him? He was born Guy Fawkes to a Protestant family in York, and his father was an advocate of the consistory court of the Church of England, so very Church of England. But his father died when he was 8, and his mother married a Catholic recusant. But at school, he was described as a pleasant, cheerful lad, opposed to quarrels and strife, and loyal to his friends. So not on the face of it, a terrorist. But then you see what in modern language we'd call a radicalization process. Because of his stepfather's Catholicism, he becomes increasingly drawn to Catholicism. And when he's 21, having inherited his father's estate at 21, he sells the lot and becomes a mercenary, fighting for Spain, the Catholics, in the 8 Years' War against the Dutch. And then he goes on to Spain after that war. He goes on to Spain to work with Catholics seeking to challenge the British monarchy. And there he meets Thomas Winter. And Thomas Winter had been sent by Robert Catesby to travel around Europe looking for young Catholic radicals who'd be willing to do some of the work on a plot to replace the king. And whilst he was in Spain, he changes his name from Guy Fawkes to Guido Fawkes. So you can see what in modern language we'd call a process of radicalization, the process of a key figure, Thomas Winter, going off and recruiting possibly naive young men to work on this plot. So he comes back to England, but adopts the pseudonym of John Johnson. So Catesby, Robert Catesby, not the name that we think of on the 5th of November every year. Catesby had decided upon the plot and had persuaded John Wright and Winter, who hadn't initially liked the idea, and got Winter to travel in Europe recruiting the helpers. And the first thing that you then ask is, well, if all of this is going on, what did the state know? Well, at the time, the head of the security service, in modern parlance, was Robert Cecil. He was Spy Master General. And he had a network of spies across Europe, infiltrated into Catholic movements and more generally gathering information. And we know from some of the records that at least by the 21st of April, 1605 is the year of the Gunpowder Plot, we know that at least by April that year, one of his spies had reported Guido Fawkes as somebody who had been recruited into terrorist activity. This putting it in modern language. But it appears they didn't know his pseudonym when he got back to England. They didn't know he was trading as John Johnson. And it's possible or probable that that intelligence got lost in the woodwork, that there was, they couldn't see the wood for the trees. They were gathering so much intelligence. It's possible that they didn't find Fawkes's name and identity until after the 4th of November in all the intelligence they brought in. So in modern language, we say there's an intelligence failure. Okay, so they're spending all this time looking for terrorists and they miss the critical one, or one of the critical ones, as it turns out. Now, I'm going to carry on like that because it makes it easier for me to just move the slides down. This is the Houses of Parliament at the time in 1605. So forgetting the modern idea of the two big chambers with all that open space around. The parliamentary buildings, Westminster Hall and the chambers and associated stuff, at the minute sit on an island, effectively, surrounded by roads and open spaces. That's not what the Palace of Westminster was like in 1605. It was a palace. And it had grown up on an ad hoc basis, and it was a network of buildings. So on this slide, you can see, if I wag on my thingy around, here's the House of Lords, a pretty unprepossessing little building. That's Westminster Hall, the building that's still there, where the Queen lay in state, for example. That's St. Stephen's Chapel. And tucked up the back here, not looking very impressive, is the House of Lords. And then these buildings are private houses. They're a courtyard of private houses. And as it happens, that building there was rented. Thomas Percy was made a gentleman pensioner of the king in June 1604. And that meant he could live in one of those houses. And he ended up living in the house on the end there, which belonged to John Wynyard, keeper of the king's wardrobe. And Thomas Percy installed Guy Fawkes as the caretaker. So we've installed a known terrorist in a building that adjoins the House of Lords. This is really sensible stuff. Now, according to the official government report, what they then start doing is trying to dig a tunnel from that house into the area underneath the House of Lords. But the more you read about it, the more it feels like Michael Caine and the Italian Job. They start digging a tunnel, but then Thomas Winter's confession, when he's being interrogated, he says, well, we started to dig a tunnel, but then we heard a noise above and we investigated to discover there was actually a cellar above that happened to be right underneath the House of Lords. So we decided we didn't need to dig the tunnel, we'd just rent the cellar. Problem with the whole of that story is no evidence of such a tunnel was ever found during any later demolition. And Guy Fawkes himself did not admit to the tunnel story until his 5th interrogation. Yeah, which makes you question whether it was true or had been planted in his brain. And when they took him there, he couldn't take them to the tunnel. So even at the time, they couldn't find the tunnel. So the mythology is they were digging a tunnel, but probably that's just a planted story. So anyway, they leased this storeroom cellar under the House of Lords from the same guy, from John Wynyard. So we now have known terrorists renting a cellar under the House of Lords. Do we not think that one or two alarm bells might have been sounding by this point? And here's a little map, just to illustrate the crassness of this whole thing. So you've got the river is on your right here, and there are some stairs down to a jetty on the riverbank, and a public passage that leads through to the rest of the Palace of Westminster. Here's the House of Lords, and here's the house that was being rented by the terrorists. Okay. And the location is quite important in that you can see you've installed terrorists right next to the House of Lords. But also, when you think about the getaway route on the night, the getaway route on the day of the explosion was ostensibly out through there, down the passage and onto a boat on the riverbank. That would have been the getaway route. So that's the first thing, a rain check of just what is going on here. They buy gunpowder. This is now June 1605. They buy gunpowder and store it in the cellar. However, if any of you know the River Thames, you will know that before Bazalgette and the building of the embankment, the Thames had a very, very muddy foreshore, and the water at high tides, particularly in storm conditions, would come right up into the buildings. And here's Whitehall Palace. This is the Palace of Westminster and Whitehall Palace. And you can see that the buildings are opening right onto the mudflats of the riverbank. The opening of Parliament was scheduled for the summer of July, but it had to be postponed because of an outbreak of the plague. And so they went off to do other things. And funnily enough, when they came back, the gunpowder had rotted because it had got wet. So you store gunpowder in a cellar and it gets wet and it's useless. So they have to clear it out and replace it. Still, we are told nobody had noticed. Okay, your level of disbelief needs to be suspended. So the state at this point is still saying, we did not know. We had no idea any of this is happening. Now, the state narrative is that they only discovered, this is an image from a publication, they only discovered it because of a letter sent to Mount Eagle, who was a nobleman who was a Catholic, who immediately gave it to the king. So we don't know who sent the letter, but the story we are told is that somebody wrote to Mount Eagle advising him not to go to the state opening of Parliament, which was scheduled by then for the 5th of November. But he got that letter on the 26th of October. There's a suggestion that the guy who tipped him off is Tresham, who was one of the broader circle of conspirators and was actually Monteagle's brother-in-law, but we will never know. What did that letter say? Sorry to keep doing it like this, but it's the only way to make it work, given the way I've got it set up. Here's the letter. We don't know who sent it. What we do know is that a servant of Monteagle tipped off the conspirators that the game was up and that they'd been rumbled, the king had been warned. The conspirators sent Fawkes, remember, he's the junior gopher in this. He's, the caretaker, the junior gopher. He's supposed to make sure the gunpowder gets in the right place. And he's sent off to check the cellar, and he confirms that nothing has been touched. So they think, oh, maybe the authorities have dismissed this. There is no evidence whatsoever of any royal checking of that cellar. So you get a letter effectively warning you that there's a conspiracy. And if we are to believe the narrative, they decided to do nothing. And they left it from the 26th until the night before the state opening. The state opening is due on the 5th of November. And they choose to do the search at midnight. The obvious time to do a search, really, at midnight on the 4th of November. It was about midnight. Sir Thomas Knyford had been ordered to search the rooms below the hall, and he found a bloke called John Johnson, we now know him as Guy Fawkes, leaving the cellar. So Fawkes had been here to check. He wasn't about to blow it up. All of those myths of our childhood of he was caught red-handed with the matches and the fuse, complete tosh, because it was in the middle of the night and Parliament wasn't due to assemble till the next day. So they weren't going to be setting the fuses till the following day in the daylight, when they could actually get the people they were targeting. So all of the evidence is that Fawkes was given the job of looking after the gunpowder. It's alleged that he was carrying a fuse and timer, but that's not entirely clear. And it's alleged that, what was going to happen was he was going to light the fuse. Now we're talking 1600s here. We're not talking about modern delay fuses. That he in a cellar where they piled up gunpowder and then they put firewood. There's firewood around it, normal and straw and stuff, the normal stuff you get in a cellar. He was going to light this fuse and then have time to get out down that passageway, down onto the riverbank, on a boat and away. If you ask me, he was, how shall we say, expendable, I think is probably the phrase that you might use. The idea that he was going to manage all of that and get away okay. So it didn't happen like this. He's caught leaving the building. So there is evidence there was a conspiracy, and there is evidence of Guy Fawkes being a fall guy, the expendable in this, the suicide bomber rather than the organizer of the conspiracy. So who were the conspiracy? Most people in our childhood, we think of Guy Fawkes, we don't necessarily kind of know there's a conspiracy, but I suspect most people would be hard put to name any other members of that conspiracy. There they are. That's the grouping. Percy, you will recall, in the middle is the guy who'd rented the house and put Fawkes in as his caretaker to do the donkey work. Catesby was the originator of the conspiracy, and Winter on the far right of the image was the guy who'd recruited Fawkes in Spain. So that's the grouping. They were all executed in January 1606, but the mythology has really tended to focus on poor Guy. So what was Guy's role? Well, there are some problems with our traditional narrative. First of all, after arrest, he was tortured. Examples of modern torture weapons, of torture weapons at the time. The king gave specific instructions about how he was to be tortured. Initially, he was manacled, then the rack, and then et sic purgados ad imatem tenditur, which means, and so by degrees proceeding to the worst. So they were going to be ranking up the torture of him until they got the answers they wanted. There is a complete record of his interrogation, or at least a summary written question by question, and you can see an extract on the right. And crucially, in his first torture, he's at the tower, he's being interrogated by the lieutenant of the tower. At the beginning, he's really clear he's a bit part actor. So they ask him, so what was going to happen if you killed the king? Well, I was never told what was going to happen next. Right? He's a bottom of the food chain guy. Can we just remember, of course, you're not allowed a lawyer. You can torture people. You're going to get them to say whatever you like. And in modern language, everything that happens in the interrogation would have been excluded from the court because it's obtained as a result of oppression or in circumstances which are like to make the confession unreliable. And to show you the scale of what happened to him, I'm sorry to be doing it like this, it's very unprofessional, but here's his signature at one stage of the interrogation, and this is a fair way into the interrogation, and here he's suddenly saying, oh no, I knew what was going on. I knew they were going to take Princess Elizabeth and put her on the throne of the Queen. This is the eldest daughter of King James I. But just look at those signatures. There's two versions of his signature. You can see the bottom one is his signature. You don't have to be a handwriting expert to be able to look at those two signatures and work out the levels of torture he was going through. So the way confessions worked, it was written by the authorities and you signed it. Look at that bottom signature and realise just what psychological state he was in by that stage. So that confession and everything in the interrogation in modern law would be out before we started. The second piece of evidence against him was a conversation that was eardropped between Winter and Fawkes. Winter and Fawkes were put in adjoining cells in the tower and were talking to each other, it is alleged, through the wall. And a spy was listening. Now, we rule that out today as Section 78 case unfairly obtained evidence, fruit of the forbidden tree. You can't do that. That's cheating. So the only evidence we really have in modern language is the fact he was caught leaving the building. That's it, which is enough to certainly get him into bother and certainly implicate him. But we don't really have evidence we can rely on about how involved he was. So then let's have a look at the trial. There you go. The trial in Westminster Hall. You can see that big hall, modern hall where the Queen laid in state. What did he say at his trial? Answer: you were not allowed to give evidence in your defence. Up until 1898, defendants in English courts were not allowed to give evidence. It's not that they weren't obliged to, they were not allowed to. And this was a medieval Catholic rule in origin. It's an old Star Chamber rule that said a defendant there was too great a risk that a defendant would lie to avoid being convicted, and that would damn his soul by lying on oath. And therefore, to prevent him damning his soul by lying on oath, we wouldn't let him give evidence at all. It's a really simple solution to a problem of damnation. So it wasn't until 1898 that defendants were allowed to give evidence in their trial. There was a sort of fudge in 1883 when they started allowing defendants to give unsworn statements. So they could give their version of events, but it wasn't sworn evidence. But finally in 1898, they allow defendants to give evidence, but are given the right to silence. That is, they don't have to give evidence, but they can. And of course, since then, in 1994, it's been changed that actually we can now draw inferences from silence. So we flipped the position in 100 years from you're not allowed to give evidence to, well, if you don't give evidence, then we'll draw conclusions from your silence. The sentencing was horrible. They were ordered to have their genitals removed, to be burnt before and burned, and then their eyes, bowels, and hearts were to be removed. They were to be decapitated and dismembered. They were dragged from the tower. The left-hand slide here shows them being dragged on wattles, think James Naylor, from the tower to Westminster, and then they were hung at Westminster. Fawkes was hung last, but he undermined them rather by it's alleged that he jumped, so that the fall with the initial hanging was more severe, and he actually therefore broke his neck and died. So he wasn't still living. The idea with the others was they inflicted those mutilations whilst they were still alive. So what do we know? We know he was radicalized. We know he was recruited to a terrorist conspiracy. All of the evidence that we have suggests that he was a pretty junior bit part player in it. So why has our entire memory of this event crystallized around him? And that's a thing called reception studies. And And reception studies looks at, well, how we receive and handle and change things with time. So why were we using this one event and this particular character? The image of him being caught by candlelight under the Houses of Parliament to whip up anti-Catholic sentiment for centuries. It was actually a statutory day of Thanksgiving up till the 1850s. They passed an act of Parliament saying it had to be a day of Thanksgiving right into the 1850s. It's still studied in school. There's a National Archives classroom pack of key documents for schools. And when I first did this talk 30 odd years ago, the narrative was still the traditional one. But now, thankfully, the National Archive pack for schools says, finally, there is no doubt Guy Fawkes is remembered incorrectly as the main plotter, a myth perpetuated by generations of children celebrating bonfire night. It's inconceivable the authority didn't know of the plot well before the night they caught him. They let it run to almost the 12th hour, but they arrested him the night before. But James's advisors were media savvy, a bit like Suella Braverman. They knew the value of demonising the other. And what this did was give them a golden opportunity to personalise, to put a face to that evil. So they didn't really push the entire conspiracy, because that would have kind of highlighted the fact there were a lot of people who were discontented with what was going on. So they focused on that single person and that single event. And this is the proclamation that they issued immediately on the 5th of November in the hunt for Thomas Percy, the guy who'd rented the house that Fawkes was caretaking. And it talks about being one of the most horrible treasons that was ever contrived. And it sounds just like Donald Trump. It's the language of Trump, that overstatement from day one. And from day one, why is it now not doing that? Oh, I see. Hang on. We've got to go back to this way of doing it. From day one, it was being linked to the Armada. So on your left, a thankful remembrance. You've got this idea that they'd come through water, the Papists, and they'd come through fire, the bombing, and England had been saved by the grace of God from these terrible Catholics. So it was linked to the Armada. And he had relics. This is alleged to be the lantern that Guy Fawkes was holding. So it becomes a sort of souvenir-based thing. And the story becomes one of the lone wolf. Look at that example. How often do we see that rather than saying there's a system failure, there's a more general problem here. We go for a young man or a young group of men who've fouled up, who've done something wrong. And you see all of that written in the Guy Fawkes story that we inherited. I think there's one PS, though, that's really rather interesting. If the terrorists had succeeded, the assumption was that not only would the king be killed, but his eldest son would be killed. And his other son, young Charles, was a sickly kid, and they didn't think he was going to last. So the terrorists were not going to put all their money in that particular cause. So the terrorists decided that the eldest daughter, Elizabeth, looked a possibility, and they were going to put her on the throne as a puppet monarch. They might have had their hands full. In later life, she became a real thinker. She corresponded with Descartes. She corresponded with William Penn and Robert Berkeley on religious matters, including what Quakerism was about. And the Act of Settlement in 1701 gave the British throne to her daughter Sophie and her descendants. And George I, her grandson, became king. So in the end, Elizabeth's line did become the modern monarchy. And she turned out to be a really feisty woman of brain who had her own mind and her own thinking. So I think they may have got more than they bargained for if they had put her onto the throne. Questions, comments? It's a story about radicalization, about governments and spies, about questions about whether actually the government deliberately delayed to the last minute, or how media savvy they were being at the time, because they instantly were putting out the right press messages. So they'd clearly thought through what they were going to do, and they deliberately delayed it till the last minute.
There's a thought to conjure.
So should we be celebrating Guy Fawkes Day?
This is what's the
The slides, sorry.
Okay.
What's
the slides. Oh, I can see you, but you can't see me.
I have children who used to say that.
No, I can see you on my split screen. Stop video. That will work. No, that turns me off completely. That doesn't help.
You should have a green stop share button or something.
Oh, I see. Yep, found it.
Oh, that's better. Yeah.
Right. Now, was the Catholic Church, as the phrase goes, were they involved in all this, or were they able to say, "Not us, Governor"?
Well, they didn't officially, in this country, of course, officially they didn't exist, because they were what in modern language would be a prescribed organisation.
Jenny had her hand.
It was really, I'm just trying to think about that question. The focus of the way the James's government tell the story is a combination of anti-Catholic but anti-papacy, anti-Spain. Hence, it all gets tied up with the Armada. There's a sort of little nationalism in the narrative that's all mixed up with Protestantism versus Catholicism, and it's somewhere it's between the two. They're telling an anti-foreigner and an anti-Catholic narrative, and it's never clear what the Catholic authorities' role, if any, was. There's nothing in the narrative that says the Catholic authorities abroad were steering this, funding it, or whatever. But that's the link that the government makes. I can't see that there's any evidence that says it was being deliberately funded from abroad. Jenny had her hand up. Hello, Jenny.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, good. I thought I'd tell you that our family stopped supporting this. Once I got married to my husband, we do not go and celebrate Guy Fawkes Day because we think it's barbaric to celebrate the burning of a human being.
Yes, particularly because he wasn't burnt. They did all these other things to them, but they didn't burn them. It's yeah.
So,
Yeah. Just on a little historical point there, it was Elizabeth's daughter Elizabeth who was in contact with William Penn and Descartes.
I thought it was Elizabeth herself.
No, she died, I think, in 1661 or 62. So certainly before William Penn got involved with Quakers.
So it was Sophie's sister.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that correction.
That's all right. She did have an awful lot of sisters and quite a lot of brothers as well.
Yes. She Elizabeth herself was I think busy having children.
Yeah.
Although not a lot of them lived that long.
That's unfortunate.
Yes.
Yes.
So, is there any family relationship across to the Queen Elizabeth, or is it just no connection at all, just by name?
What you mean, Queen Elizabeth I or Queen Elizabeth II?
Well, not Queen Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I.
Queen Elizabeth I. Yes, because, oh, come on, somebody's going to get this right for me. James I was
First cousin once removed.
something like that. Hang on a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots,
Who was a first cousin of Queen Elizabeth.
who was cousin of Queen Elizabeth.
Okay, right.
All very incestuous.
Shocking.
Okay.
Wouldn't be
No,
allowed
hang on.
to
No,
really.
he's described as the cousin of Queen Elizabeth, but actually his mother.
Yes, I mean they used cousin much more
Cousin,
loosely in those days than.
Second cousin, I think, in modern English. So it makes perfect sense that you name your eldest daughter after the person you're about to inherit the throne from.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does sound as though the way you tell the story, it does sound as though the agents of the crown were reasonably well aware that Catholics were conspiring to come to power, and were aware of the network, at least, of people who would be involved in that.
It is certainly clear that they had extensive spy networks and knew a lot of what was going on, and there's documentation from the period that shows quite a lot of what they knew. It's certainly the case that this particular conspiracy, at the very latest, they knew about it on the 26th of October when the Mount Eagle letter was handed over. And I've never seen anything that explains why it took them from the 26th of October to the 4th of November to search the cellar. And the only conclusion you can really reach is that this was a deliberate. Nipping it in the bud on the 26th of October would not have been as media sexy as nipping it in the bud at midnight the night before Parliament was going to be open. That's changing its propaganda value. And why did they wait that long to check the place out? If you'd have been handed that letter warning Mount Eagle to stay away because the place is going to go up in flames, you'd have searched every inch of the place, wouldn't you?
I would have thought so.
Yes, so it sounds like Guy Fawkes is the perfect American word for it is patsy, or no objection towards Patsy, who is sitting on my left at the moment as I see her through the gutter. Nothing to do with you, my dear.
No, it's a use of my name, which I've always resented deeply. In fact, when I chose to move from being called Pat, over which I had no choice as a child, when I chose to change to being called Patsy, I was warned about the possible embarrassment of the double use of the word.
So, Chris, I'm wondering if you feel that there is a resonance with the present times, and that the present regime is suspect, and whether some kind of regime change is necessary, and perhaps the local churches should be involved in this, or am I reading too much into that?
I think there are. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd go on record in those terms. I think there are resonances for the way we handle young people who are radicalized. There's a lesson for the way we the media manage and spin the demonisation of the other.
Yeah.
There are a lot of lessons in it.
I'm sort of joking, and you're seeing that there's genuine deep stuff going on. Yeah.
Well, I must admit, after the attack on Israel, I did wonder, because their intelligence services are supposed to be the best in the world, and they say they knew nothing about it. Nobody's resigned, as far as I've heard, and yeah. Anyway, we had conspiracy theories a few weeks ago, and I missed that, so I'll shut up for now.
Why fireworks? I don't know.
Well, explosions, gunpowder.
Ah, of course. I should go and sit over there.
It's all mixed up with Halloween and winter festivals, isn't it? It's the coming of the dark and the repelling the dark. So you have fires and lights and all the rest of it at this time of year traditionally. And Protestantism would try to sit on some of those things. And one argument I've seen is that Protestantism didn't do that sort of thing, didn't really do Halloween. It was much more of the sort of thing that Catholicism historically kind of fits with Catholicism historically, around All Saints and All Souls and the how thin the veil is and all the rest of it. But if you're trying to suppress that sort of approach to spirituality, you can see why having an alternative reason is quite convenient. It's like the Chinese government at this time of year. In Chinese culture, historically, you have the Mid-Autumn Festival, beginning of October, Mid-Autumn Festival, which is a lantern festival, a light festival. You eat mooncakes. It's the harvest moon. So it moves around, but it's end of September. The Chinese government, the coming of the communist state, that gets, when do you pick for your national day? You pick the 1st of October. And you put in place celebrations that mirror the Lantern Moon Festival, so that you have you've kind of sanitized or attempted to sanitize an indigenous festival.
Where I used to live down in Sussex, and one of the towns in Sussex does on the 5th of November, which is Lewis. They do their kind of what they call lighting up the darkest night, where, instead of fireworks, they roll tar barrels down the road. If anyone knows anything about Lewis, the hills are like that type of thing. So it's quite a spectacular thing, and as you say, this does nothing to do with Guido Fawkes, so that it's kind of goes nearly paganized in that sense. It was.
What's always interested me is the way we have all these festivals, working towards, say, December the 21st, the darkest point of the year, and then everything goes quiet. The festivals all come in that last quarter of the year, heading up to, the celebration of New Year's Eve is relatively modern, isn't it? I think I might be wrong there, and then it goes quiet right up to Easter, and I just want, and yet that is the darkest, coldest time of the year, and most people die then.
Historically, the New Year was celebrated in March. It was the New Year was celebrated as the beginning of the productive year.
That makes more sense.
all those early spring festivals. We do have summer festivals, but we tend not to celebrate. We used to have May Day. People used to do Midsummer.
Yeah.
It's just they've got lost, whereas we seem to have felt the need to hang on to festivals during the dark months.
And of course, one of the cynical things which I think about the Guy Fawkes and that type of thing, that nearly this is the government saying, if you try and attack the king or government, look what will happen to you. So don't even try it, mister. It's kind of that nearly, well, this could happen to you, mate.
And there's something inherent in us that we do need festivals in the dark, because Islam's slightly different because it runs entirely on a lunar. So that its big festivals move around more, but Judaism, even though that has more of a lunar tie for some of its dates, Diwali and Hanukkah and so on, and the pagan festivals all seem to reflect a need to remind ourselves that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not, to use a phrase. It's just unfortunate this one has got hooked to a young man who got radicalized.
It does sound as though he got radicalized quite seriously, though. He, having grown up a Protestant and then somehow or other, well, through remarriage, he now has a, I guess, stepfather who's Catholic, and then becomes a mercenary. I mean, that's no small thing, and so he won't just have been radicalized; he will actually have received a military training, if only by virtue of going and fighting in Europe. So it would be probably inaccurate to think of him as a young kid who has been been in bad company. He's taken it properly seriously.
Yes.
I suppose, and also it depends on your educational equivalent, because you usually find people who get radicalized are usually looking for someone to join, looking for someone to follow, looking for this idea of belonging, being part of. And if you're part of this radical thing, which you can feel very positive about, and your people around you are being that positive as well, it's very easy to get sucked into this kind of whole idea of we're doing, I suppose, in a sense, God's work. You can feel that this is the right thing to do. And if you've got people who are egging you, as the phrase gets, egging you on a bit, it can become, can take over your life somewhat, because we've seen that in people who do the de-radicalization techniques with some of the more young fiery blades who have gone forward, and they say that this idea it inspires you to actually do things you wouldn't normally do within your outside life. It's maybe I'm on the wrong path there, but
there's a whole context, is there not, of the state, the King Henry peeling off the English church from Roman Catholicism, and othering the Catholics, and that being done, by the state with the tearing apart of monasteries, seizings of property. I mean, this wasn't small. This was a pogrom against Catholicism, and if you were part of the oppressed minority, you had lost privileges, and you could well feel resentful, and you couldn't air it in public because everything was all sort of pro the Anglican Church. Is that fair, Chris? Was the background as intense as that?
I'm not a historian, so there's a point at which I don't like generalising because I'm not convinced I know enough. But yes, my instinct is yes, but that's not a historian's assessment.
Yes, there's certainly in the pamphlets that Quakers wrote and people wrote against the Quakers, one of the big insults that they sent to each other was, people said Quakers were papists in disguise, and this sort of thing. It was still very, very strong, then, and I think, it was only 20 odd years after that James II was, thrown off the throne because he was Catholic.
And that anti-Catholic sentiment, if you think back to your childhoods, it's still present in some parts of mainland Britain, never mind Northern Ireland. But in our childhood, I don't know where people in the school grew up, but you were aware of it in our childhood.
Yeah, certainly in mine. I mean, my mother had not a good word to say about Catholics. They were meant to be dirty, and the men all drank, and it was just horrendous. I don't know if she actually knew any Catholics, but yeah, and at school, it wasn't helped by the fact that at school, the Catholic children, of whom there were a few, had to go and sit on their own when the rest of us were having religious education. And it made it, that was a bit of, I don't know that we would have known that they were Catholic children had this not happened, but I suppose they would have been instructed not to sit in on that education anyway. But no, there's feeling against Catholics, really.
Jenny's got a hand up.
Jenny.
Right. I have a horrendous story about Catholics in my family. My mother was brought up as a strict Catholic. Her name was O'Sullivan, so she would be, wouldn't she? And it was a very large family. And then my grandfather was with a printing firm up in the East End of London that moved out to the Newbury area. And he got involved with building the big Catholic church that's in Newbury. They brought with them the younger children. The older ones by that time were getting married and had jobs in the city, so they didn't come. And one of my uncles was smashed to pieces by a train running for the train to get back home at the end of the day. And the priest actually said to my parents, my mother, and the children, the younger children, he said, it's your fault because you haven't been coming to church enough lately. And that went round the family, and every one of the family left the Catholic church. My mother had to go to London to get married because she wasn't being allowed to get married in the church in Newbury or any of the others. And I stood beside this my mother while she was talking to this Catholic church one day, and he looked down and he looked at me and said, "Ah, this is another one of your illegitimate children, is it?" Because he'd cancelled out all her getting married in the Catholic Church, everything. And I think when you've got vindictive religion like that, it does eventually make a lot of people walk away from it and have nothing to do with it. Yeah. I mean, just a whole very, very large Catholic family walked. That's not love.
So it's the same process of radicalization and othering that we're seeing in all over the place at the moment. You know, it's not different, and what's happening today, particularly in Israel and Palestine, is just as violent, and on a larger scale.
And we see the same processes of some people respond to statistics and data, but propaganda tends to focus on the individual, the humanizing of the narrative, and we're seeing that in lots of contexts at the minute. That use of the exploitation of an individual's position in what actually is a system problem, to turn it into something that's, people don't want to be told this system is failing. That's a difficult question. The Zeebrugge ferry rolls over and people are killed. It is much more convenient for us to say, there's somebody who didn't shut the bow doors properly, rather than we've got a system problem here, we're not properly manning these vessels to save money. And that individualization rather than tackling the system problem is something we've always been, we're not unique as a society being tempted to go down that route.
Here's another thing which is in that I have friends who have worked for many a year for the probation service. Now, the probation service, as you probably know from the past, was privatized by this present government. And the private firms downsized lots of people. So you had less probation people to do the same amount of work, which obviously didn't work, which obviously, as we've seen from all the things that have come forward, you know, there's just not enough people to do it. And that has been something which said the probation service, terrible, they're not doing their work. And they're not doing the work because they haven't got enough people. But now they've had to renationalize it again because of all the terrible things that have gone on. Someone has had to stand up and go, we're doing it because it was wrong. You know? But no one is being held responsible for this debacle. We are again saying lessons have been learned. We will do better. But they're not, because they haven't got enough people and they're not recruiting enough people. The old probation people have now left. And you know, it's a proverbial mare, as the French will call it, show. But there you go. I hate to do things on that type of thing. But Christopher.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think as Quakers, we also need to be careful because what Jenny said about her grandmother, was it? I can think of people who have, been frightened away from friends because we haven't been as kind as we might have been or supportive. Or we've actually, we've been critical. Yeah, I just didn't want us to go away feeling, holier than other people, because I don't think it's true. But I think I'm going to go in a minute before somebody's unkind to me and I burst into tears.
Would we be?
Now, would we do such things, Christopher? But if you are going, I can actually say about.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I'll stay where you thank Chris, because it's been very stimulating. I'm really glad I came.
Chris, thank you for correcting the thing about which Elizabeth it was. That was helpful. David, when you edit it, I'm always cautious not to have people have shared some quite personal things. So I assume you're going to cut the recording somewhere before the conversation so that we don't particularly get people's personal stories. But I hope you will keep in Chris's correction.
Yeah, I'm not normally, I don't regard myself as a sort of arbiter of taste and what's said, and people do know it's being recorded. Is there anybody who feels there's anything that they would rather didn't appear in the recording? If so, I will chop it out. But people, these don't get thousands of views, that's for sure. And we talk about our lives amongst our friends. I've never seen comments or heard any sort of blowback from anything, but it's a good point, Chris, that we should be aware when we're recording our events that it does become a bit public.
Yes.
But
interesting to find out if I put myself in the firing line with those comments about Hamas and that. Anyway, we will won't we?
So far we have. It's very rare for anybody to comment in the way that we're used to seeing stuff appear on social media. So it seems that people see the word Quakers in the title, and that's enough to restrict the audience to fellow travelers, or at least sympathizers, I think.
Thanks, everybody. It was fun digging that out. I did it. I hadn't looked at those slides, the data. They were on old-fashioned slides. I had to scan them in, and hadn't looked at the data for 20-something years. So that was fun to dig it out.
Yeah, great.
Give me an excuse to dig it out.
And it was very good for us to hear that sort of thing as something which a lot of us, as you said earlier, hadn't considered in that way. So all of our appreciation for your wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
And I'm sorry I couldn't get the slides to progress quite the way that they would normally do, but hopefully we just got there in the end.
They're there. It's good.
And this is the time, because I am what my folks would say, a bear of little brain. I pass across to Patsy and say, and Patsy, next week we are having.
Oh dear. Yeah. I really wish you hadn't done that, because
Jeffrey Smith and insulation.
I knew who it was, but I had a feeling he had a really complicated title. I don't know if have you got the second line?
It's quite possible, but the book is called Insulation.
It's
That's the fella.
So
it's about get that wrong.
The title could well be far more complicated, about how we are all about to join up in clubs in streets and retrofit our houses. So I think it's going to be interesting. So bit of a switch from bit of
as
a
I say, as I say, usually tell your friends, your granny, and other members of your meeting to come and listen to such wonderful hours that we spend together.
maybe
And
maybe retrofitting is a form of modern day torture. We'll find out from Jeffrey. Thank you, Chris.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye everybody. Thank you.